So it turns out a lot of people were duped. Back in about 2005 through 2015, there was a very popular movement that said that Jesus didn't exist. And I think what fed into this were big blockbusters like the Da Vinci Code, which acted like Christianity was a conspiracy theory.
Open your eyes. Witness the greatest cover-up in human history. Mankind can finally be set free.
A lot of pseudo-intellectualism, a bunch of nonsense, frankly, that was fiction, but sort of, I think, got embedded itself into people's minds. And then a lot of popular figures like Bill Maher and Christopher Hitchens, and a well-known atheist who I think thought that they had been duped by religion and wanted to use reason, turns out, in turn, to be duped by something that is just blatantly false.
There's no, this is a plain statement that anyone could make. Jesus of Nazareth is not a figure in history.
You really do believe Jesus never existed?
No, I say there's no reason to believe that he did.
This ridiculous idea that Jesus of Nazareth wasn't real, that he never existed, that he was sewn whole cloth together from pagan myths, copied and pasted from things like the dying and rising God myths. But, so if you can't tell, my wife and I, my family and I, we moved, and this is the new library. I'm really excited about it. It is in a basement room, but I'm going to try to make it as nice as I can. I have more space here than before, and I'm excited to share some things with you, hopefully in the future. But as I'm unpacking, I came across some books from ancient history, and I just wanted to share these passages with you in case perhaps you've been duped, or if you know Jesus existed, but you wanted to share evidence is a good thing, right? It turns out, by the way, just for what it's worth, internet atheists are usually harder on the Bible than scholars. New Testament scholars, whether they're believing people or non-believing people, tend to take the Gospels and 1 Corinthians especially, not as historically worthless. These are some type of biography about a man that scholars do think en masse exists. And just a couple of examples of historians I've read several on this. Maurice Casey is a late historian. He passed away, sadly. He wrote a book basically saying that this popular idea on the internet that Jesus never existed is really ridiculous. Fundamentalist people, I don't want to be cruel to fundamentalists, but sometimes fundamentalists can be very anti-intellectual and not do very much research and just be very emotionally passionate about their beliefs. Well, Maurice Casey, this historian, who doesn't have beliefs like I believe, basically said that atheists on the internet are essentially like those fundamentalist Christians. They're so anti-intellectual, they don't do scholarly research, they're just passionate and angry about their beliefs, but now they're just turning around against Christianity. And he says this idea that Christianity didn't exist is ridiculous. Bart Ehrman is a non-Christian scholar, very well known, and he also wrote a whole book on this, that obviously Jesus existed. He said that whether we like it or not, whatever else we do with Jesus, he existed whether we like it or not. And I just wanted to share with you some of the ancient books from ancient history that historians look at. So this is Lucian. This is actually an interesting one. This is the Loeb Classical Library version of this. By the way, my library looks expensive, and it is, but you can get a lot of these books on thrift books. If you're starting out your library, don't feel like you have to spend a lot of money starting out. So in the book, The Passing of Peregrinus, Lucian, who mocks Christianity, he mocks religion, but inadvertently provides evidence because he's a very early figure, very early, talking about Christ. The Christians, the poor wretches, have convinced themselves first and foremost that they are going to be immortal and live for all time, in consequence of which they despise death, even willingly giving themselves into custody, most of them, knowing they'll die. Furthermore, their first lawgiver persuaded them that they are all brothers of one another, and that they have transgressed once for all by denying the Greek gods and by worshiping that crucified sophist himself and living under his laws. And so Lucian knew that the Christians were following somebody he thought was a sophist who had been crucified. This is very early. Tacitus in his histories and the annals of history. Now, he was a very sort of influential, high-end, elite figure at the time. He was a historian, but ancient history and modern history don't quite work the same. They weren't trying to do the same thing, and it even varied upon the culture in the ancient world. But Tacitus does provide really solid evidence for Jesus. Not that he knew him personally, Jesus would have been one of those petty desert people to the Romans, But Jesus of Nazareth caused such a stir that the Romans in Rome were quite aware, because his religion was spreading throughout their empire very quickly, not centuries later, but immediately, essentially. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, which is almost definitely, Christ in the Latin form, suffered the extreme penalty under the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of that evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So Nero blamed the Christians, and the Christians get their name from Christus, or Christ, who suffered the extreme penalty, which would have been crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. This is one of the reasons also I struggle with Islam, because for those Muslims who claim that Christ wasn't crucified, there's just significant evidence from the ancient world that he was. And then we have Christian sources like Ignatius of Antioch. Though you may not trust him, he probably knew, he was trained by or knew the apostles who knew Christ. And so you don't have video evidence, you don't have TikTok back in the day, you don't even have the Gutenberg printing press. But when you have Christian Jewish sources like Josephus and pagan sources like Lucian and Tacitus all attesting to this difficult figure called Christ, you have more than sufficient evidence that Christ existed. On top of that, many scholars I've read take 1 Corinthians to be written actually by the Apostle Paul, who scholars would say he actually thinks that he saw the risen Jesus in the mid-50s AD, so about 20 years, within about 20 years of Christ's crucifixion. And then 1 Corinthians 15 is, of course, many historians would say that's a creed, an oral creed passed down from much earlier than that 20-year span. So if you just think about it, I'm getting a little older now, a little long in the tooth. I remember things from 20 years ago. So if it was a significant event like 9/11, I would remember it. So if it was this man who shook up the entire Jewish religion, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and caused such a public execution because many thought he was the Messiah, people would remember it. And Paul says, hey, go talk to them if you don't believe me. One thing I've noticed is that atheism, I think it's bankrupt. I considered it strongly. If you've been duped by this zeitgeist type stuff, the Bill Maher's of the world, I think Bill Maher's been duped. Have some grace with yourself, but correct course. I can understand being skeptical of many of the things religious people say. I can genuinely understand that. But atheism, to maintain its atheism, and the more extreme forms of atheism that say that Jesus didn't exist, they have to lean more and more not into scholarship and knowledge and reason, but into skepticism. So much so that they have to destroy the historical method or question all the evidence. Jesus existed, whether we like it or not. Whoever you are, wherever you are, I hope you know your life matters. Someone somewhere loves you, so do take care of yourself. Know that someone misses you when you're gone. And always just keep seeking what's true, what's good, what's beautiful. Thanks for watching. God bless.